This is a story of who we were, how we got here.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility.
And where we are going.
You've got mail.
So join us as we take history off the page.
'Cause you were born this way, baby. My mama told me when I was young, we're all born superstars. She rolled my hair, put my lipstick on, in a glass of her boudoir. There's nothing wrong with loving who you are, she said, 'cause he made you perfect, babe. So hold your head up, girl, and you'll go far. There's only way to say I'm beautiful in my way, 'cause I make no mistakes. I'm on the right track, baby. I was born this way. Don't hurt yourself and regret. Just love yourself and instead. I'm on the right track, baby. I was born this way.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to History Off the Page. That was Lady Gaga's hit single Born This Way from 2011, which is actually one of the most popular, best-selling singles of all time. And in some respects, it's not hard to see why, right? This is not just another pop song about love, about sex, hooking up, okay? This is actually a strong assertion of minority identities. It is a symbol in some ways of kind of one current of the 21st century global culture, especially in Europe, in the United States, this idea of celebrating diversity, of recognizing diversity and saying this is a good thing. It's okay if people tend to be a little bit different than me or have different backgrounds or different interests. And in particular, of course, this song is about what at the time was known as the LGBT community, the lesbian, gay, bisexual, maybe a little bit transsexual community, and people feeling a sense of pride and people feeling a sense of the kind of legitimacy of having that identity, right? Even the words, I'm born this way. There's a whole discussion going on in the late 90s, early 2000s that we can get into about, what is homosexual desire? Where does it come from? Is it natural? Is it a choice? Right, and so Lady Gaga is kind of contributing to this moment, to this discourse with this hit song. And in fact, she thought of what she was doing as basically what she called her freedom song. Freedom songs are sung in the 1960s by civil rights activists. Lady Gaga and others see this moment in the early 2000s as the kind of next version, if you will, of the civil rights movement. We've made improvements in race, or at least, again, improvements, didn't say we fixed it. Now we need to think about gay and lesbian people and achieving equality for them. Now, some of you might also say, well, wait a minute, LGBT, that's such an old way of putting it, right? Isn't the current acronym LGBTQIA+? For those keeping score at home, that stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, asexual, and then the plus sign is kind of to capture everybody else. We'll put an asterisk on this because basically the questions about sex and especially now about gender have advanced from when Lady Gaga even sang this song in 2011. So we're not going to kind of get into the more modern elements of the story, but what we're interested in is the LGB and to some extent the T part of those acronyms, right? The idea that being gay is an identity. This is something that, as we'll see, is relatively new historically speaking. We could also add to that the idea of saying I am heterosexual, the idea of saying that my sexual preferences fall into a category of identity that define who I am and that kind of draw these very clear boundaries, that is also something that is relatively historically new, as we'll see. This starts at the kind of tail end of the 19th, very beginning of the 20th century, this idea that sexual preference equals identity. This is going to be something new. Now, before we get into the history part, again, I do want to make just a couple of really important clarifications because this is an intense debate today. This is intensely political, and I don't want to go off the rails. I don't want you guys to feel like I'm trying to take you in some place and make this political, because it's not. It's about understanding how we got where we are, not about what you think about where we should go. So first, when I say that people did not think of themselves as gay or straight before about 1900, I do not mean that people were not engaging in what we would describe today as gay sex. On the contrary, history is littered with plenty of people that are having same-sex relations or encounters going back to the ancient Greeks. And whether we're talking here about kind of physical sex, people, not to get too graphic, but like penetrating each other, or whether we're talking about just these kind of bonds of affection where people are, you'd say cuddling, maybe they're kissing, maybe they're just sort of touching each other, right? Maybe it's more of an emotional connection. These feelings clearly exist before 1900. What's different is not the question of desire, but it is the question of identity. Again, people living before 1900 do not understand homosexual desires as a reflection of a deeper core identity in the way that people would understand that today. To help kind of clarify this, let me give you a sort of absurd example that once I say it will give you a sense of like, okay, I understand the difference now in what you're talking about. There was, of course, a very famous Marilyn Monroe movie from 1953 called Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. And this is a stereotype about some men, lots of men, right? Gentlemen just like blondes. To say that people, or especially that men prefer blondes, is not a claim on identity. Nobody is running around saying, hey, you know what? I'm a blonditarian. I prefer blondes, and that really, it not just sort of circumscribes who I'm thinking of in terms of potential emotional or sexual partners, but that says so much more about my personality, about my masculinity, my femininity, whatever my sense of gender is. To say that you prefer blondes doesn't really have any connection to that. And if someone did say that, you'd say, well, that seems kind of silly because the two aren't linked together in our modern minds. In fact, if you did meet someone, they say, well, I prefer blondes. And you said, well, do you find brunettes attractive, or whatever the male equivalent of a brunette is? Do you find gingers attractive? They might say, well, it's not my preference, but if I met the right one, if emotionally we were compatible, they would say, okay, this is my preference, this is what I usually do, but it doesn't circumscribe the totality of the options that I have as a human being. And so again, that's kind of more the mindset that people have about sexual preference before 1900. Some people do feel very strongly, okay, I only want to date or I only want encounters with people of the same sex. And some people would say, well, no, I don't want any encounters with people of the same sex. I only feel an attraction to people of the opposite sex. But the idea of there being a gray area is much more socially acceptable in the idea that this is not sort of, again, I don't want to say genetic because that gets into the whole, are you born this way? Is it a choice? But the idea that your choices and actions are circumscribed because of your identity is much less prevalent. So again, the pre-1900 world features people carrying out these kind of same-sex sexual acts or sexual encounters within the course of their normal lives and expectations and behaviors. It's not common for people to think, oh, I'm a deviant, I'm a pervert, I like these kind of, I move in this particular direction. It's more that they think, okay, I am going to have this otherwise taboo interaction. And maybe that's something that they embrace and they want to do often. Maybe it's something they only did once or twice. Maybe it's something that's only in their minds that they never actually carry out. But they don't think about themselves as having their identity circumscribed by it. Some men and women, as I said, are going to engage in homosexual relations pretty frequently. That's their preference. They really don't want to do anything else. They want to hang out in bars. They want to have even sometimes a life partner, right? It does happen. More commonly, though, these types of same-sex relationships happen in certain circumstances. So it's very common for the men to be married and to think, okay, yeah, I'm married, but I'm going to have this encounter. Again, maybe it's a one-off deal, maybe it's a regular deal. It's more like the idea of having an affair for a traditional heterosexual couple in the minds of that person than it is in the idea of I am part of a separate community who just does things differently. Another common element to it is that, just as now, sex is often linked to wealth and power. So perhaps these sexual encounters that are going on, same-sex encounters, it is not necessarily just about the sex, but it is about a form of domination or submission. If you have ever seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia with Peter O'Toole, one of the things that happens to T.E. Lawrence is he gets captured up in Syria and he is raped by a Turkish forget if it's like the commander or the commandant or something, but whoever the Turkish jailer is rapes him. Is that a crime of lust? Does the Turkish jailer think about himself as being gay? Probably not, right? It is probably more linked to power. It is linked to the idea of dominance, hierarchies. Sometimes it's linked to money. There are plenty of people floating around the 19th century, especially in the middle of 19th century Europe, in cities that are kind of destitute. How are they going to survive? It's not just women that will turn to prostitution. And when we use that word prostitution today, we think about it as being, the world's oldest profession, right? It's a profession. What do you do for a living? Oh, I'm a prostitute. I'm a whore. In the 19th century, again, that's not thought of as being an identity. There are plenty of people that will, from time to time, have sex for money, but they would not say, oh, I'm a prostitute, or this is what I do for a living, right? It's literally just something you do at one moment just because you got to make ends meet. Hey, are you destitute? Are you, in hard times? I need some lumber hauled away. Here, I'll give you, $20 an hour. Come haul this lumber away. Nobody's sitting there thinking about, well, that means that now my identity is I'm a this or I'm a that. So these sexual encounters are going on in the 19th century, as I said, they're just not linked to identity. Sometimes maybe the person does have a preference. Think about the kind of James Bond sort of rapiness where, Bond sort of gets kind of worked up and he sees a woman and he says, oh, I want to sleep with you. And she's like, well, I don't want to sleep with you. And he just keeps kind of badgering her until she does it. Again, if you like cultural references, if you've seen the show Outlander, if you don't like spoilers, you haven't seen it, then just skip over this part because I'm going to give a spoiler. But one of the characters is kind of portrayed as being gay, right? Again, that identity doesn't exist, but he does like sleeping with men, especially to dominate them, and especially Scottish men. And so at the end of, I think it's the first season, finally he's going after this one guy and he kind of finds a way to leverage him into having gay sex. Again, would the guy have said, oh, I'm gay, I'm a homosexual in the British Army? Probably not. But he would have just said, I enjoy these encounters, or, I felt that this was necessary. I needed to assert myself. Okay, so again, point number one, when we say that people do not have gay identities, it does not mean that they are not having gay sex. Quite the opposite. A lot of that's going on. The second point relates to the first in some ways, and I, again, can't emphasize this enough. Just because people in the 19th century do not think about themselves as being gay or as being lesbian or as being homosexuals, again, as an identity, that does not mean that it is illegitimate for someone to think that way of themselves today. Again, we have seen in this course many identities that have evolved and changed over time. If I said to you, there is no national identity in the 15th century in Europe, that doesn't make it illegitimate for you to say, I'm proud to be an American, I'm proud to be French, I'm proud to be German. That doesn't make that identity any less legitimate today because it didn't exist before, right? Just to say that it didn't exist before doesn't mean it's unnatural or that it's a choice, right? We're not making judgments about that. So again, the point of today's discussion isn't about whether homosexuality is legitimate or natural or what you should think about it. Think whatever you want about it. But what we can say is that the idea of sexual preference did not express an identity before 1900. How it came to do so, again, is the topic of our podcast today. Okay, enough with the long preambles and caveats. If you've listened to History Off the Page for a while by now, you know that I love to have my long introductions and frame things. But let's get into some actual history here. So as I've said several times, throughout the 19th century, people thought of issues related to same-sex sexual contact as actions or encounters, not identities. So why does this change? There are a couple of reasons for this. The first of which relates to public discussions about sex in general. For the most part, before 1900, sex is not really seen as something that is worthy of public discussion. You're not supposed to be talking about, at least in public, how attractive you find the opposite sex, your sexual preferences, what you did with someone last night. These are seen as things that are supposed to be about procreation. To the extent that people are talking about sex and sexuality in the 19th century, it's usually focused on the idea of procreation. What is the point of sex to most Victorians? It is literally to make babies. And anything beyond that is kind of taboo. You shouldn't be talking about it. You shouldn't be thinking about it. Even really until the kind of quite recently, married couples are not supposed to see each other naked. When you go to bed at night, you're either supposed to have your PJs on, or maybe you get into bed and then you take your clothes off. But even married people are not supposed to be looking at each other. They're not supposed to be having sex for fun. They're not supposed to be using contraception, because the entire idea, at least publicly, is sex is about babies and it shouldn't be about anything else. Now, obviously, this is not the reality of the situation. Obviously, people are experimenting. People are having sex outside the bonds of marriage. People within marriage are having sex because they like it, because it's fun. But the public discussions of it tend to be very limited. By the late 19th century, however, the rise of social Darwinism, increased imperial competition between states, and the consequences of industrialization, you're going to start to see a falling birth rate, not just because people have kind of less food, especially in the beginning of the 19th century, but as they advance to become middle class, they stop having as many kids. So when you put all these things together, especially in countries like France, where the birth rate is falling, and it seems like, oh my God, the Germans are getting stronger and stronger each day, the politics of sexuality are not just about the idea of deviancy or taboo or sin. They start to become about national health. And so more and more public commentators will start to talk about sex in public, talk about what's appropriate, talk about what shouldn't be used, especially contraception. But just the idea of sex becomes less taboo as a topic of discussion. Now, one of the big discussions that they have, one of the big sort of solutions they come up with, led by members of the medical community, is we must crack down on venereal disease. This is what is driving part of the falling birth rate. And so by 1900, again, it's not just this question of let's talk about sex, as the famous song goes, but let's regulate sex. Let's not just have prostitution willy-nilly. We need men, we need doctors, we need churchmen, we need laws regulating the illicit sex trade. Now, it's also feminists that want to participate in this discussion, as we talked about a little bit before, right? In terms of equality, the idea of men having sex outside of marriage was long embraced, was long socially accepted. The idea that men would brag about their latest conquests. We're rewatching The Tudors right now. All that King Henry does with his buddies is brag about who they're all having sex with. So some of these feminists are saying, well, we want equality. If men are going to have sex outside of marriage, then so women should be able to too. And so again, these currents are out there. It gets talked about more. There is more interest in regulating some aspects of it. And so as a result, sex is more not on the individual mind, because it was on there before, but sex is more on the public mind as we get out of World War I. And even beforehand, as we see the consequences, as I said, of industrialization. The second major reason that the public becomes more interested in sex is tied to human nature and our everlasting fascination with scandal. If you listen to the previous podcast episode on The New Woman, I talked about the book La Garçonne, which is basically The Tomboy. It's about this woman growing up in France. Her husband's cheating on her, and so she starts behaving like a boy. And the book is scandalous. Oh my God, how could you write something like that? How could you even imagine those sort of crossing of gender boundaries? And the book sells tens of thousands. It is enormously popular because we love scandal, right? If you want to look at the question of how does someone like Rupert Murdoch today, how did they get to be super, super wealthy? Well, part of it is that they take over flailing kind of magazines like The Sun. In Germany, there's one called Das Bild, and they pump it full of scandal. They pump it full of nudity, all the taboo stuff, like all the low class, the way that they would describe it culturally speaking. But that makes it really popular. So by the time you get to the late 19th century, we have an urban society. We have hundreds of thousands and millions of people living in cities. We have these nude reading networks. We have industrialized production of newspapers, cutthroat competition. How am I going to sell my magazine? It's kind of like cable news today, right? What made cable news popular? Well, the idea of scandal, the idea of outrage, right? To get those raw emotions of people. And so one of the great sources of scandal at the end of the 19th century is to start talking about sex. And not just sex in general, but especially royals and sex and abnormality, or in one of the most important kind of examples of these kind of sex scandals, in the idea of homosexuality in men, because it shows effeminacy. So to provide some historical context to this, let's talk about the Eulenberg Affair of 1907, which included accusations of homosexual behavior by some prominent German aristocrats who happened to be close friends of Kaiser Wilhelm II. Now, the most important of these was the Kaiser's close friend, Philipp von Eulenberg, but there are also some others in that circle. Basically, the way it comes to trial is very interesting. Basically, this journalist, Maximilian Harden, publishes some accusations about this, and instead of letting this go, Eulenberg and others sue Harden, who happens to be Jewish, so he's kind of an outsider. They sue him for libel. They say, you're demeaning the pride of me, of the aristocrats, of Germany. And so it becomes this sensational trial, which is kind of it suffers from this phenomenon later called the Streisand effect. The Streisand effect is for basically when you try to censor or limit information or contain it, and in doing so, you actually draw more attention to the thing than it would have originally had in the first place, and so it kind of becomes more and more sensational. The term comes from a case in 2003 where basically there's this photographer that took pictures of Barbra Streisand's house, which was, he was trying to kind of capture images of beach erosion. And so it kind of implied that Streisand's mansion was sort of responsible or contributing to this. So Streisand didn't like it. She tried to sue him. And in the end, it actually brought more attention to the story than if, this guy had just taken this photograph and posted it in this obscure location. Nobody would have ever really heard about it. But because Streisand sued him, it made it into a news media story, brought more attention to it, and popularized it. So that's the Streisand effect. And so this is basically what happens with the Eulenberg trial. Now, what's interesting about this isn't that it's just, these guys are having gay sex, they're homosexuals, this is bad. It is that it's not that they're necessarily homosexual, but that they are effeminate. And by effeminate, I don't just mean that they are cross-dressing or lisping or things like that. There is a guy who does cross-dress. His name is Dietrich von Hulsen-Hasseler. And he likes to put on a tutu and dance in front of the other guys. And, isn't this kind of funny? Until he has a heart attack and he drops dead. There is some of that going on here. But it's not just like Drag Queen Story Hour meets Prussian aristocracy in the beginning of the 20th century. One of the biggest issues that come up is that the guys are acting in ways that are effeminate, emasculated, that don't reflect power. So one of the guys has his wife called to the stand, and she says, well, I was mad at him and I slapped him, and he didn't hit me back. He just took it. He let me be the dominant one in the relationship. In fact, this guy, it's not that he's out there trying to have these kind of weird, relations, these taboo relations with his buddies. The problem is he never wanted to have sex with her. He never wanted to come to her bed. What's wrong with this man? A good man in the Wilhelmine era in Germany, or the Victorian era, for those of you that are more familiar with Britain, good man should be virile. He should want to be having sex as much as possible because he should want to be asserting himself. He should want to be powerful. He should want to be fulfilling his role as a procreator. But here's this Prussian aristocrat who doesn't seem to want to do that. What is going on with him? So while the idea of homosexuality, the idea of homosexual relations or preferences was never something that was kind of openly celebrated in European society or openly really accepted, in these particular ways that it is framed in public discourse, they are enormously problematic, not because of the sexual transgression, but because of the gender transgression. Men are behaving like women. Men in power, men who should be authorities are behaving like women. Oh my God, what are we going to do? If you are someone that does not like the Kaiser, especially after he dismissed Bismarck, kind of decided to take Germany in different directions, well, this is a really powerful criticism of the weakness of the German monarchy. If you are a critic of it, if the problem isn't that he's not aggressive enough, he's not assertive or nationalist enough, the problem is that he's too much in that direction, this is still a good criticism. Again, in this frothy era of national chauvinism right before World War I, being weak is the problem, and being weak gets associated with men who want to have sex with other men. Part of what these discussions do is obviously they attack the sexual preferences of the Prussian aristocrats who are being targeted here. But as it gets more and more popular, as it spreads, it makes people go, I am like that guy. I have those preferences. I like to do those things too. What does that make me? Am I also not, to some extent, a victim of this public discourse that looks at things that I like to do and says those things are wrong, those things can't be tolerated, those things are, it's not just like, well, you shouldn't do it in public, but you shouldn't do it at all. It makes you less of a man. And so as often happens in the course of history, when you belittle someone for something, when you attack them for something, they tend to rally around that and transform that into a sense of identity. What is the biggest moment in the formation of German national identity? What is the thing that really lights the fire and awakens it at the start of the 19th century? It's the French treating the Germans, in their opinion, poorly. Finally, a third related factor is the increasing separation of the idea of sex and procreation. Again, as we've said several times on the podcast, right? The point of sex, for publicly at least, for people living in the medieval period, living in the early modern period, the point of sex is supposed to be to have babies. But by the end of the 19th century, you have sexual reformers who are talking about, well, maybe there are other reasons that people want to have sex, reasons that are legitimate. Maybe it is linked to emotional well-being. Now, nowhere are these types of discussions more intense than in Central Europe, where a number of sexual researchers engage in heated debates over topics such as masturbation. Is masturbation healthy? For a long time, people said, don't masturbate. It's very bad for you. You'll grow hair on your hands. But they start rethinking that. They start making different arguments about it. Right? What about sex and love? How do those go together? What about the idea of sex within marriage and female orgasm? Shouldn't women be orgasming too? Right? Doesn't that help to make a happy marriage? We talked about that again a little bit on the last podcast on the New Woman. And so as people again start thinking more and more about sex and what it links to, the idea that, well, homosexual sex is out there. Maybe we need to think about that too. Maybe we need to study it, research it. So all these factors increase public attention on same-sex desire. That said, we're still not at a place where most people conceived of a close relationship between sexuality and identity. Or to put this another way, significant numbers of people continue to engage in sex with members of the same gender, but they don't think about themselves as being either hetero or homosexual. Now, another element in this story is that when you look at law, what is actually illegal versus what is sort of socially shunned or taboo, laws do not ban homosexuality in the 19th century. What they ban are homosexual acts, individual acts such as especially sodomy. It is not, for example, illegal for two women to kiss. So why would that matter if they did that? Why would that link back to identity? Now, there's a whole other tangent that we could take here. We're talking about the politics of sexuality and sexual preference. In the current world, in the 21st century, we tend to argue or tend to treat being gay and being lesbian as being the same thing, right? The experiences of gay men, the experiences of lesbian women, okay, we're talking about homosexuality. That is a late 20th century discourse. The way that lesbianism is treated versus the way that homosexuality for men is treated is very, very different. And again, a huge part of that goes back to not the sexual side of things, but the idea of acting masculine versus acting effeminately. For women to act effeminately doesn't really matter, doesn't really bother many people because they're already acting effeminately. So the problem here is, again, that they're crossing gender barriers, not necessarily the physical things that they're doing. Again, as the German historian Dagmar Herzog has argued, these encounters tend to be transient. Sometimes they're transactional. We're talking about homosexual encounters. They tend to cross class divides. They go into sort of liminal spaces that exist in 19th century society, and they're understood in those terms. I'm going into a liminal space, not I am engaging in this particular type of act that should be, again, tied to identity. Again, to get into the mindset of how people perceive this, it's more like saying you went to see a prostitute than it is like, when somebody comes out today and they're married and say, oh, well, I was married to this woman, but, then they're having lots of gay sex. Oh, okay, now my identity's gay. And okay. It's more like a man coming out and saying, well, I saw a prostitute last night, even though I'm married, right? Which is not okay, but it would be perceived differently today than it would have back then. There's also a sense of permanence about it too. If someone says they're gay today, that is a sense that their sexual preferences fit into a permanent direction, whereas people in the 19th century wouldn't have said, oh, this is permanent. This is because I did it this one time. That means I'm always going to do it that one time. And of course, I know I'm going on a tangent here. In the last 5 years, people have started rethinking this and said, oh, actually saying homosexual, heterosexual, those in terms are limiting. We're going to blow those apart. Now we have people that are non-binary, people that are doing different things, right? Well, sometimes they prefer one thing, but it doesn't mean it's permanent. There's a whole another episode we can do on what's happened really since the early 20-teens about sex, gender, and identity and how these things are rapidly evolving before our very eyes. But again, before World War I, homosexual, heterosexual identity, it's highly limited, but it's just starting to emerge. What begins to change this in earnest, right? World War I is obviously going to be a part of this story, which will not surprise any of you because we've been talking about it so much. The war accelerates these trends to the part where we start to see the emergence of a clear sense of sexual identity after 1918. We mentioned just a moment ago anxieties that were caused by prostitution among the public. Well, as you might be aware, right, war causes kind of breakdown of sexual barriers and people start engaging in more and more sex. And of course, this is also true of prostitution during the era. The war also, however, creates more opportunities for same-sex encounters, which again, like all these other examples, you're talking about crossing ethnic boundaries, class boundaries, racial boundaries. So the idea that you're crossing sexual boundaries is also not that surprising. Another thing that the war does, of course, as we've talked about, it devastates some of the traditional institutions that were most stridently against homosexuality or homosexual acts, or however you want to phrase it. We're talking about institutions like the Catholic and Protestant churches that, for the most part, supported the war. So the war is going to be okay. And then, of course, what do you get? Disaster. So they are less effective in trying to make people or convince people of the idea that homosexual encounters or homosexual relations should be taboo. What does it matter what the Catholic or Protestant church says after millions of people have died? Who cares about middle-class sensibility? Who cares about the nationalists and the elites and what they have to say? Bourgeois respectability just doesn't seem that important anymore in a world that kind of bourgeois culture destroyed. It's in this climate that a number of sexual reformers emerge who began to make the case for sexual reform, and in particular the idea of decriminalizing laws against sodomy. Now, the best-known figure in this regard was the German physician Magnus Hirschfeld. Hirschfeld was born in Pomerania in 1868 to a prominent doctor, and he followed in his father's footsteps, earning a medical degree by 1892. He then goes to the United States for a while. He spends about 8 months, mostly in Chicago, and it's here that he starts to become interested in homosexuality. And he soon begins researching the topic when he returns to Germany. In 1914, he'll publish a book called The Homosexuality of Men and Women, which begins to treat sexual preference less as an inclination and more as a form of identity. In addition, he made the argument that these trends or these desires transcended national boundaries, that you could find people that were homosexuals or were engaging in homosexual behavior in pretty much any portion of the world, right? This isn't like the Iranian president who several years ago said, oh, we don't have any gay people in Iran, right? Magnus Hirschfeld would say, of course you do. Right? It's not that hard to find. The key point there is if it is transcending cultures, then the source of homosexuality is not cultural. It is not linked to any one particular national group, but it is most likely biological. Now, there's a lot of things that Hirschfeld does. We don't have time to get into all of them. He coins the phrases transsexual and transvestite, which really become sort of core concepts or core terms for 20th century discourse about homosexuality. As I said, Hirschfeld is very, very public in his efforts to kind of reform the German penal code. He founds something called the Institute for Sexual Research in 1919, which then becomes a beacon for those who are struggling with these questions of sexuality after the war. Some of you will be very familiar with this Broadway show called Cabaret. Later gets turned into a movie with Liza Minnelli. Joel Grey plays this kind of androgynistic, kind of creepy MC. Very, very popular. You'll recognize a number of the tunes. It is kind of an autobiographical sketch by, again, this British writer, Christopher Isherwood, who is in Berlin while he's going first to go to the Institute for Sexual Research to try to figure out, okay, I'm having these thoughts. What does that mean? How should I understand them? So by the late 1920s, there is a robust and transnational group of sexual researchers who begin to advance the argument that homosexuality is normative and that it is an identity. That, to use the words of Lady Gaga to some extent, that people are being born this way and it's not something that they can change. Now, at the same time that you have this kind of academic movement and interest in homosexuality, you also have the emergence, really for the first time, of, especially for gay men, gay culture in major European cities. It exists to some extent a little bit in the kind of Wilhelmine period, in the late Victorian period, so really right on the first decade or two before World War I, but it explodes in the post-war era where there is more tolerance. There's less pushback from institutions that have been weakened. In a country like Germany, you no longer have the kind of stiff conservative monarchy that's there anymore. You've replaced it with a democratic society where one of the democratic values is people should be free to be different. Why is Christopher Isherwood in Berlin? It's not just to go visit Magnus Hirschfeld. It's because there is, by that point, a network of prominent clubs and bars that cater openly to gay patrons. Now, even though sodomy is still illegal, there's a number of ways that the bars can kind of get around this idea, right? One of them is just to circulate word, like, okay, if you're gay, like feel free to come to this club, feel free to come to this bar. We are going to let you in. We're going to serve you. We don't really care about it. Others take an even more enthusiastic approach. Some bars like the El Dorado in Berlin, for example, will organize same-sex dances. They will hold balls that include cross-dressing. And as the gay club scene grows, publishers started offering travel guides that could help visitors find the right type of venues to suit their needs. Now, as I mentioned, gay and lesbian are not synonymous. The experiences, at least of the people, are not synonymous. For gay men in the early 20s to start finding places to go is something that becomes doable because the idea of men being out on the town is very socially acceptable, right? At what point does the gay person get outed as gay other than having the actual act of sodomy, right? The idea that two guys are in a bar and they're talking to each other, there isn't anything inherently problematic with that unless they're openly kissing for most people during this period. So the point is to set up a gay bar or a gay tolerant bar isn't that difficult. What about women, though? What about lesbians? It's much harder for a single woman to say, I'm going to take a trip to Berlin because I'm not sure about my own sexuality and I want to research it and I want to explore it and I want to go sleep with lots of different women. But the idea of promiscuity, at least until relatively recently, has been heavily associated with gay men. The idea of promiscuity and lesbians is not quite the same. It's not linked, at least culturally speaking, the perceptions are not linked quite as much. What happens in the 1920s? Well, we start seeing guides published for lesbians. Here is a bar. Here is a coffee shop that you can go to, and the chances that one of the women there is gay or is at least open to same-sex relations, it's pretty good. Finally, we also see an explosion in publications. Won't surprise you to know that there is a lot of not just guidebooks, but pornography, right? And this is also true of straight pornography as well, right? Once the printed image becomes easier to do, once the taboos come down, the censors are less restrictive in the Weimar Republic, for example, in democratic governments in France and Italy and other places, right? The porn is going to circulate just a little bit more freely. Now, so far we've been talking mostly about homosexuality. I just want to point out that these trends often largely are similar for heterosexuality and in particular female sexuality. I did a whole podcast before on the new woman. We talked a little bit about this, so I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of detail about it now, other than to say that for the first time, people start saying, well, you know what, actually, people having sex for pleasure, whether or not it has anything to do with procreation, that is now going to be seen as something that is legitimate and that should be socially acceptable. I mentioned in our last podcast, for example, the Dutch physician Theodor van der Velde, who wrote in 1926 a book called The Ideal Marriage. In this book, he talks about if you want to be a happy couple, sex needs to be about more than just, okay, the guy decided he wanted to do it, and here is his 30 seconds, and then it's over with, and now hopefully the woman gets pregnant. Like, that's not a good strategy for a healthy marriage. So again, people start talking publicly about sex in general, not just for gays and lesbians. Finally, just to tack onto this, it's also worth noting it's not just the sex reformers, the discourse that we see this, it's also just in the urban environment as well, right? Where's the number one place to encounter sex and sexuality today in American or European culture? Is it not in the media? Is it not when you watch these shows? I mentioned the Tudors, like people are just going at it like jackrabbits. The idea that someone in one of these shows has like a dozen sexual partners within a season or two, right? That's totally not bizarre at all, right? I watched Ted Lasso recently. Love Ted Lasso. It's great. Why is one of the leading female characters, she has a new sexual partner every season? Forget about just the sexual act, though. The 1920s cities are full of glitz and glamour that we tend to associate with modern life, In particular, images of attractive people doing attractive things in order to get us to buy those products. People are seeing advertisements of women in the little black dress by the time you get really the 1920s, 30s, right? A little bit later into the 40s. Women are seeing advertisements. Men are seeing advertisements of people in their bathing suits. The body is increasingly on display in the 1920s and 30s. But if I ask you, what's one of the most popular sports, globally speaking, in the 1920s? So maybe you'd say, oh, it must be soccer. A little bit. Soccer's growing. Baseball, yeah, definitely in the United States. How about boxing? Isn't boxing the sport that really draws the crowds and the attention and that people really get their hopes up about? Well, what is boxing? Isn't it really strong guys running around in basically their underwear, hitting each other, sweating, getting all sweaty? Right? I'm not saying it's exclusively sexual, but again, the body becomes a topic of public interest in the 20s and 30s. If we had more time, we could go into the whole thing about nudist clubs, nude bathing, right? Oh, isn't it so healthy just to have your whole body and be out there in the sun, right? This becomes a really big deal, especially in countries like Germany in the 1920s and to some extent the 30s. Okay, the end results of the changes that we've discussed today are basically twofold. In the short term, the increasing presence of sex in public life, be it through discussion, advertisement, gay clubs, etc., this makes increasing numbers of Europeans and Americans anxious about the future. Now, this is not because Americans and Europeans are prudish, or they're repressive, or they just like structures of power, they're misogynistic. It can be read that way, and certainly it's unequal, but I think we need to be fair to them and try to understand their viewpoints. It's not just about the repression, it's more, I would argue, about the anxiety. Think about it. For centuries, the politics of reproduction lay at the heart of human culture and social organization. What happens if we begin experimenting with sex, which means we're experimenting with the birth rate? What if it creates more babies and we don't have enough food to feed them? Right, today, most people are not worried about global starvation anymore because the population is largely stabilized. Over time, wealth spreads. People have smaller families. Right? There are obviously pockets, areas where people don't get enough food. There's malnutrition. There is starvation in the world today. But the kind of Malthusian zero-sum, like, we can have more of our people live, but that's going to make other people die. We've kind of moved past that for the most part. But what if in the 1920s we don't know that? We're not that far distant from this moment of general anxiety about having too many mouths to feed. What if, on the contrary, births start to fall? What if we have not enough people? What if society stops replicating itself? It's not hard to put yourself in their shoes and to think, gosh, we're playing with fire here with something that is pretty darn important. If we screw this up, the ramifications could be pretty profound. What happens if we start tinkering with the idea of the nuclear family, which is predicated on the idea of one man, one woman, and they're going to be locked together from a sexual standpoint? They're not going to, have sexual encounters outside of that one relationship the rest of their entire lives. And of course, part of that is not just to have legitimate offspring and the economics of it. Part of it is to be able to say, okay, here's a role model for Timmy. Here's a role model for Jane. We want people to have role models in the nuclear family is how we kind of get through that after we have the breaking apart of the village during the Industrial Revolution. If we start playing around with this, what could the potential consequences be? What happens to inheritance? In theory, is an inheritance supposed to proceed along familial lines? Well, what happens if everybody's having sex outside of marriage and now the children are not tied to the unit of the couple getting married? Again, we're not that far from an age when not just kind of social status, but literally legal and political rights are based upon who your parents are. if the idea of the parental union no longer matters so much, if people are creating offspring outside the parental unit, well, now what are the consequences of that going to be? So the point is that these issues related to sexuality are about more than just sex. It is also about politics, about society, about economics. You know, what if men begin acting in effeminate ways? If they stop being assertive and strong and unemotional, who fills that gap? Today, some of you might say, well, women can step into that gap. Okay, that makes sense, right? We believe in equality. But in the 1920s, we haven't gotten to that point yet. Simone de Beauvoir has not made her arguments as to why we need more social equality in terms of gender. If women start having sex for pleasure and begin to move away from the idea that their lives are to be centered on motherhood, how does society persist? How does it replicate? How do we raise children? Not just physically make them, but raise them if the person that was responsible primarily for nurturing them is no longer going to think of themselves as fulfilling that role. And oh, by the way, we're just coming out of the Great War. We just killed millions of people, especially millions of men. We have a birth problem. Is this a good time to tinker with all of the structures that up until now have provided for children, family, inheritance, upbringing, etc.? All this is not to say that the movement towards equality, the emergence of gay cultures, all of this is not to reject that. It's just to say you can understand why some people had anxiety about it and what it might lead to. So the result for many people in Europe is that, again, this is increasing their anxiety, all this sexual anarchy. What is the antidote to anarchy? The short answer is authority, but usually it's sort of centralized authority. And in the case of the 1920s, it will be fascism. Fascists will run on an explicit program of, we are going to go back to the basics. We are going to provide order. We are going to make men men again and women women again. And, we will put everything back the way it should be. Of course, we can hang a slight asterisk on that in the German case, because many of the early fascists, or at least significant number of early fascist men coming out of the trenches, guess what? They were away from women. They bonded emotionally with other men. They began to experience sexual longings or desires for other men. And so there is, up until 1934, a cadre within the Nazi Party of young men who are practicing homosexuals. I say practicing because either they identify themselves as homosexuals, kind of, not officially, but kind of it's not a secret, or they engage in these and think about it as being a sexual act that you're engaging in, but you're still married. Over the course of the 1930s and 40s, fascist movements will make control over sexuality and the politics of reproduction an incredibly important part of their mission and their programs. This ranges from the promotion of hypermasculinity, the cult of motherhood, to the repression of homosexuality and the introduction of eugenics. A lot to get into there, and as I said, we'll get pretty soon into questions about fascism. We're going to do a number of episodes, and we'll talk about fascism and gender down the road. In the long run, of course, fascism's efforts to regulate sex politically largely fail. In the 1960s, the Youth Rebellion would once again prioritize the notion of sex for pleasure, emphasizing the virtue of having sex beyond procreation. Public discussions, suggestions, and even displays of sex and sexuality have become increasingly public, although in certain cases, of course, they're still contested as well. Now, the 1960s also witnessed the birth of a political movement related to sexual identity, including what we call the queer movement, that argues for the legitimacy of homosexual identity and calls for more legal and social equality. The major event that kind of touches this off, just to get ahead of ourselves a little bit, is the Stonewall riots in New York City. That takes place in June of 1969. Basically, it's a gay club, gets raided by the police. They mistreat or mishandle some of the patrons there. And so it launches a movement that says, hey, wait a minute, why are we being treated different? And so that's the origins of the kind of modern wave of interest in equality related to sexual identity. So again, these movements have been contested, and I'm not trying to tell you what you should think about them, about legitimacy, naturality, choice, etc. That's not what we're here for. But what we as historians can say is that at least to the present day, Hirschfeld and van der Velde's visions of human sexuality seem to have won out. One final thought before we go, however. As I record this episode in 2023, the politics of sexual identity are rapidly evolving. At the start of the century, what reformers really called for was legal and social equality between homosexuals and heterosexuals. Right? The idea that you had two categories, one of which was treated unequally, and so we wanted reforms, things like at first civil unions, later on the idea of gay marriage, right? We want equality between not the genders, but between the sexes in terms of sexual preference and identity. Today, the notions of being gay and straight have themselves come under attack. And you can find cultural commentators who argue for the dissolution of sexual behavior-based identities altogether. In other words, aren't terms like gay or straight themselves restrictive or repressive? Shouldn't we just say people should be whoever they are, they should have sex with whoever they want, and trying to circumscribe them into these categories is just as problematic today as it was, or even more so, 150 years ago? As an historian, it's interesting to think about this journey, that having achieved a fair degree of consensus, that the notion of people being born this way, as we saw in the Lady Gaga song at the beginning of the podcast, that this conviction may only last a century, maybe even less. That we as a society might wind up right back where we originally started, where the idea of sexual preference is no longer linked to an identity, where we say people should just do whatever they want and the rest will kind of take care of itself. Who knows if it'll happen, but something to think about for the future. Okay, that's our show for today. If you've enjoyed listening to the podcast, please hit the subscribe button, or you can follow us on social media. You can also check out our website, www.historyoffthepage.com, where you can find out more about the topics and see some of our source material. In our next episode, we'll start exploring the topic of fascism. We begin with a look at Mussolini and Italy and see how fascism and why fascism developed first there. And later on in the year, we'll start talking about Germany and the rise of the Nazis. We'll get into how they built dictatorships, eventually the Holocaust, and of course, everyone's favorite World War II. But that's it for now. We hope you'll join us next time as we take history off the page.